we're ready to go. And I apologize in advance, not only for boring you stiff, but also because I have a cough, and I hope I don't have a coughing fit in the middle of it. It's not COVID. I've been tested. So apologies. I've even got some hot tea if it gets really bad. And if you see me shoving peppermints in, that's the reason. So excuse me for that. But Vera Quinn is the person you can blame for this, because she rang me up and asked me, would I say something? And I'm so delighted with the project that Sinead was outlining, that I felt the least I could do was try and contribute something. So if it's dull, I'm sorry, she won't ask me again. But she just said, talk about anything, which in a way is almost more difficult than being told to talk about something. And I tried to think of something that was of real interest in the town, that had an impact on the town, and was tied up with a few topical things as well. And I thought that I would talk a bit about Emma de Vesci, who some of you might have heard of, and anyone from Abbeyleix would be very familiar with the fountain at the south of the town, where the Balacolla Road turns off from the Cork Road, and the fountain memorial that Brian Marr was actually talking about last night, or the night before. And you'll all be familiar with this fountain. And that was for Emma's husband, a memorial for Thomas, the 3rd Viscount. And his other half was Emma de Vesci. And she left a really profound influence and mark in Abbeyleix, for the good, I feel, very strongly. But I think not many people know all that much about her. So I was going to have a go at trying to convey something about her, because she was an extraordinarily interesting person. The tablet in the fountain mentions Thomas, her husband, who was the 3rd Viscount, and that it was erected in 1878. He had actually died in 1875, but obviously it took a while to have the whip round and the design of the fountain and so on. He came after his father, John, who was the 2nd Viscount, and John was really instrumental in the layout of the town in the early days of the town. And John was still Viscount de Vesci during the famine years, but Thomas was very active during the latter years of his father's life, active here in Abbeyleix, and so was his wife, Emma. Here's a picture of Emma as a young lady, and she's very attractive wife. She was his wife for 36 years, so that no short time. And I want to talk a little bit about where she came from, her background, what had influenced her, and how she'd influenced Abbeyleix. She was from England, but she had a very strong Russian identity as well. Her grandfather was Count Simon Vorontsov. He was the Russian ambassador to London. Count Simon was born in 1744. He had a military career in Russia. He was there when, I don't know how much Russian history you will know, but Catherine the Great, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you. Catherine the Great was actually a German princess who married Peter, her husband, who was a bit of a wimp, and she didn't think he really measured up. So as soon as Peter became emperor, she just didn't think he really cut the mustard at all, so she just quickly bumped him off. And Count Vorontsov took rather a dim view of this. He didn't think that's what wives really should do. In hindsight, she was probably right, because she was an extraordinarily influential and powerful empress of Russia, and became known as Catherine the Great. So after initial resistance to Catherine the Great's coup d'etat against her husband, he was immediately arrested. He was part of a very elite regiment. He and a few officers thought that it wasn't very sporting to bump off your husband in this way. He was arrested for a week, and then he realized that it was a fait accompli. There was nothing he could do about it, so he he was released, and he continued to work in Catherine's court, initially in the Russian army, where he was very brave and successful, and a senior officer. He then joined the diplomatic corps and was Russian ambassador in Vienna and Venice. He married the daughter of a Russian admiral, and he had 2 children, a son called Michael and a daughter called Catherine. And 3 years later, his wife sadly died. I think they were in Italy. The books say he lost his wife, but I think he just didn't miss Leia. I think she actually, I think she died, unfortunately. So he was left with his 2 small children and a widower. And he was posted to London and when he was 41 years old. And London clearly chimed with him very much. He actually really somewhat fell in love with the English way of life. There he is later on in his life as an ambassador. He became a great Anglophile, a great lover of English life, and he just stayed in England for the rest of his days. He stayed as a Russian ambassador for an extraordinarily long period of time. He was somewhat in and out of favour. The one constant in his political views was he was very anti-Napoleon. Again, he didn't like bumping off kings and emperors. He thought that wasn't really the way we should behave. So he was horrified by the French Revolution and very anti-Napoleon, and that was the one very strong, constant view he had. And the Vorontsovs were a very old and very powerful Russian family, so he was very rich and very influential, and very capable as an ambassador for Russia. He represented Russia very well in England. There was one point when Britain was siding with the Turks in a war against Russia, and he basically talked Britain out of it. So he did a terrific job. He was also very much took the British way of life. You can see in this picture he's actually wearing the Order of the Garter, which is the highest order that you can be given in England, short of a peerage, which he clearly wouldn't. He was already Count Simon anyway in Russia. So he had these two children that grew up, although they were already born before he came to London. There is his children, Count Michael and Countess Catherine Vorontsov, and they were educated in England and grew up in England. He lived in Marylebone area, and anyone who's really familiar with that part of London and North Marylebone into St John's Wood, there is actually a road named after him called Vorontsov Road, which is quite a big road in St John's Wood. His daughter, Catherine, who we just saw as a child in that last picture, grew up to be a very beautiful girl, very much with a Russian identity. You can see even the belt buckle she has. It's a very Russian. They tended to dress with a sort of Russian style to their dress, she actually very beguiling, and it was common in those days to have your portrait done and then have prints made of your portrait, and you can see the print of the previous portrait. And she was a very attractive young lady. In 1808, the Count Vorontsov must have been actually delighted. She caught the eye of the Earl of Pembroke, who was from one of the great English families, the owners of Wilton House down in Salisbury. He was a very influential British aristocrat. He also had the Order of the Garter. He was a lot older than her. She was just 25. He was 49. He'd been married before to Elizabeth Beauclerk. He'd had 4 children, 2 boys, both of whom died as infants. a girl, Lady Diana, who married Lord Normanton, and he had a son, Robert, who he didn't get on with. Robert went off to Paris and distanced himself from what his father would have thought were his responsibilities. Robert married a Sicilian princess called Octavia Spinelli, and it was a disastrous marriage. He married her in 1814, and it was annulled 4 years later. And he stayed in Paris. By then he'd got a mistress called Alexina Galot, and he didn't take on the responsibilities that his father felt that the eldest son should do. So Lord Pembroke was there. He was 49. He did have a son, but the son was in Paris and was a disappointment to the father. So Lord Pembroke married this lovely 25-year-old Catherine Vorontsov. As I said, she was just 25. He was 49. He was extremely wealthy, extremely influential, a very senior patrician politician. He was also extremely rich, which is always handy. His grandmother had brought into the family all the Fitzwilliam estates in Dublin. So all of Fitzwilliam Square right out to Ballsbridge belonged to that family, and still do belong to the Pembrokes today. So there was tremendous wealth there, although apparently one of the diarists of the day, Charles Greville, wrote that he always protested that he was broke. He was far from it. And he had this absolutely amazing house called Wilton, which is near Salisbury in England. And if anybody is near Salisbury, it really is, I think, the most beautiful of those great houses in England. This is the garden front, which is very famous. It has these huge sweeping lawns with famous, enormous cedar trees, and a famous Palladian bridge over the river, became very fashionable in the early 1700s. There were a few estates that had vaguely similar bridges built, but nothing, I think, as fabulous as this. In Wilton had been a monastery initially. In Henry VIII's time, the nuns were driven out of it, and it was given to the Herbert family. That's the family name for Lord Pembroke. Picture at the front, you could just see some of the early Jacobean fronts of it. There is somewhat incongruously a tractor there, but I don't think it's a Jacobean tractor somehow. But you can see the middle bit is very Jacobean. When the nuns were thrown out of it by Henry VIII, Wilton was given to the first Earl of Pembroke, who was described as a very pugnacious man. He was extremely adept at choosing the right side historically. A mad fighting fellow, that was the description I was looking for. John Aubrey described him as. He was in the time of Henry VIII. He killed somebody in a duel, went to France, was very handy in a fight apparently, was recommended to King Henry VIII, came back to England, made a good move in marrying the sister of one of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine Parr. So Anne Parr became Lady Pembroke. And somehow he always chose the right side to be on in that very volatile time in British politics. Or if he chose the wrong side, he corrected his mistake very quickly and got onto the right side. When he built the original house following the convent, and then when Queen Mary, there was reversal from Protestantism back to extreme Catholicism. When Queen Mary inherited the throne, the nuns were put back in again, and William Herbert was there at the gates, crying at the gates to the nuns that he'd sinned terribly and how remorseful he was. But in a short space of time, Mary was gone and Protestantism was restored, and there he was back at the gates, this time crying out, "Out ye jades, to work ye jades, go spin." So he was not averse to changing his mind, according to what wind was blowing at the time. There he is. He also had the Order of the Garter, and this dog apparently was the only thing he was really loyal to was his dog, and the dog too. Apparently, when he died, the dog refused to leave and pined away under his coffin. Wilton has this incredible room in it, and it's so worth it if you're ever near Salisbury to visit it. It had these Inigo Jones, one of the famous architects at the time, designed this amazing room that's it's known as the double cube room. It was originally the saloon or dining room. It's 30 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 60 feet long. And it really is just, it knocks your socks off if you go in and see it. It has this painting at the end by Van Dyck, the famous British painter. It's the biggest painting Van Dyck ever painted. All those figures in that painting are actually slightly larger than life size. And one could give a whole talk on that picture because it's the Herbert family and the various dynastic marriages and the symbolism and so on. But it is an extraordinary room. So this was the house to which Catherine Vorontsov married into. She was now Countess of Pembroke, and she was the mistress of Wilton, aged 25. The eldest son living in Paris, the father having fallen out with him. And she was obviously a very capable lady. She was a great linguist. She was very astute politically. And she was very, very fond of Wilton. And her daughters, she had with Lord Pembroke 6 children, including one son, Sidney. And that was the son that really was what Lord Pembroke had hoped for in a son. Very capable, very responsible, very dutiful. And he was quite a lot younger than his father. But he really took on the mantle of the sort of family responsibilities as his father got older. Emma, who was the youngest child of this marriage, they had 6 children, as I mentioned, five daughters and the one son, Sidney. Emma adored Wilton. She grew up there with her mother, very much the dominant figure. Sidney, her elder brother, who was, I think, 11 years older than her, becoming more and more influential as he grew up. And she looked up to Sidney very much, obviously very close to Sidney, very close to her sisters. And when, in 1827, Emma was barely 8 years old, Lord Pembroke, her father, died. Her mother, Catherine, was just 44. Sidney was just 17. So Catherine was clearly very influential still. And as I said, Lord Greville, this diarist, wrote that Lord Pembroke pleaded poverty all his life and died leaving each of his daughters £20,000. Now, £20,000 then was a huge amount of money. She probably didn't get her hands on it when she was 8, when her father died, but it obviously trickled to her. And he left his wife £200,000 then, which was well over 20 million now. That's just converting the inflation, but actually what it could buy would have been so an enormous amount of money she inherited. So she would have also eventually got Russian money as well. So Catherine was clearly very well off. And Emma was enormously close to her mother, and constantly, they were both very interested in design, in architecture, in layout, and they were constantly doing drawings for each other, designs for each other. There is Catherine, Lady Pembroke. I'd imagine that was probably shortly before or after her husband died. As I said, she was 44 when he died. And these are the sort of designs that Emma and Catherine were sending to one another. This is a design for a fire screen, I think, and they were going to input pictures of the different sisters in each panel. They were constantly sending each other pictures of urns, vases, layouts for gardens, and so forth. The other big influence on Emma was her mother's brother. you remember the old Count Vorontsov had 2 children. The brother was Michael. Michael grew up, he was educated in England. Like his father, he was a tremendous Anglophile. He was sort of slightly stiff upper lip in that sort of English way. He joined the Russian army, was a tremendously competent general. Like his father, he abhorred the French Revolution and Napoleon. He was actually very liberal in his views. It wasn't that he was very right-wing. He just believed in order, and you don't go off just chopping everybody's heads off for no reason. Little did he know what was going to happen in Russia later on in 1917. So obviously when Napoleon invaded Russia, he was very much part of the Russian military offensive against Napoleon, and as those who know a little of Russian history or who have read War and Peace will know that Napoleon actually got very close to Moscow. And Michael Vorontsov rose to very high heights as a Russian general, and he was very involved, really at the literally cutting edge of the military campaign against Napoleon. He was hugely rich and had this wonderful palace built for himself in the Crimea, so fairly topical. In Alupka, the palace cost £1 million then. He was colossally rich. He married this very beguiling lady called, that's the palace in Alupka, extraordinary mixture of sort of Moorish, Ottoman, Eastern architecture, which he linked with sort of Scottish baronial, and everybody who saw it was utterly astonished by it. But he married Elisabetta Branica, who was, well, she was obviously quite good company and a lot of fun, and very naughty. She was very beguiling, and amongst the little flings she had, although Count Michael was a very handsome man, she did have these quite a number of little flings, and one of which, the most famous, was with Russia's greatest poet ever, Alexander Pushkin, who wrote Eugene Onegin, and he's treated almost like a god to this day in Russia as being Russia's greatest ever poet. And you can see an oil painting of her a little older, when she still has quite a little twinkle in her eye, I think. This palace where Prince Michael, because he was elevated, he was such a successful general that he was elevated from Count, which was the title he'd inherited from his father. He was made Prince Michael Vorontsov by the Tsar, and he was made a field marshal. The palace that I just showed you the picture of was actually the same place where Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill signed the Alupka Treaty at the end of the Second World War. And that is the palace. There is Churchill on the left. It was the palace where Churchill stayed. Roosevelt stayed in a neighboring palace, and Stalin also stayed nearby. And that is the signing in 1946, the end of the Second World War, where Europe was sort of carved up, and Churchill subsequently made that famous speech that an Iron Curtain has descended over Europe. This was basically the treaty that brought down the Iron Curtain and said that's Russia's. And you can see the usual shifty 3 Russian generals on the right. It's actually quite interesting. You can identify the sort of stiff upper lipness of the British general here, whereas the American. They're almost the characteristics of them are almost too good to be true. So that's Yalta. That was the Prince Vorontsov's palace, and here are this would have been a monument to Prince Vorontsov after he died. Pretty early picture. I'd say it was quite a few years after he died, but he was enormously revered. He had been responsible for conquering quite a lot of the Caucasus, which is to the west. It's actually Chechen land, which was kind of the last Russian war, not the present one. But this is in actually Odessa. So I don't know whether this is still standing. This might have been bombed since February. This monument to him, and that was Lady De Vesci's uncle. So quite close connection to Abbeyleix, and she was enormously proud of the Russian connection and tremendously interested in him and all the Russian connection. I got a picture of this same monument a little later on, and you can see the plates around on the pedestal of it. That's a much more recent picture, before February 2022, and as I said, who knows what state this is in now. That's actually the plate on the side of it, and there is Count Vorontsov on the horse on the right of that picture. This is the Battle of Crayon, just on the edge of France, and he actually went head to head with Napoleon himself. You can't get a lot cooler than that, I think. So you can understand that Emma kind of hero worshipped her uncle. There's Napoleon on the left on his horse, and Vorontsov also fought in the Battle of Borodino, which was, almost the last stand before Napoleon reached Moscow. So he was very much a hands-on general who'd really been involved in the thick of the fighting himself. Much later on, after he died, when Emma was in middle age, she went to Alupka. And this is from an album of drawings because, as I said, Emma loved sketching and doing drawings and designs. She actually went to visit this wonderful palace in the Crimea. And I don't know if you can read that. It says, Alupka, drawing from my bedroom window, E. de V, 1873. And similarly, those are the hills, and that's the Black Sea. There's another picture that Emma took at the same visit. I can't fully read it, and I don't know if you can. There, maybe I'm in the way. It's probably why you can't read it. It says, I think, from salon or saloon window into the something of Alupka. And it's at 1:30 by the look of things. In 1839, winding back from that Alupka drawing, Emma, Herbert, this young girl, very pretty, brought up in Wilton, very, very close to her mother, very fond of her Russian connection. She married Thomas Vesey. Thomas, here he is, I would guess in his early 30s. He was 36 when he married Emma. Emma was the youngest of those 6 children of her mother, Catherine. She was the second last to be married. She had one sister who was married the following year, who very sadly died the subsequent year. But Emma was the youngest, and I suspect Emma was the closest and possibly the most spoilt by her mother. She married Thomas, who I think, it's interesting that the two wives both married older men. So she came to live in Abbeyleix. Thomas's father was still alive, so he wasn't Lord De Vesci. The year after Emma had moved out and married Thomas, maybe Catherine, the mother, thought, was getting a bit bored without her daughter to doodle with. And Catherine started this amazing project to build a church at Wilton in England. This astonishing church called St. Nicholas, which was very different to anything being built at the time in England. It was very much more on the Italian model. It had a separate bell tower, campanile. She spent a lot of money on it. And which architect did she call to do it? She used the diocesan architect for Salisbury being the nearest big town to Wilton. The diocesan architect for Salisbury happened to be Thomas Wyatt, who was a Roscommon man from Loughlin. And so he built this with, I'm sure, a lot of input from her. And Thomas Wyatt went on. He obviously had a close connection. He must have met them through the Salisbury connection. He went on to design for Sidney. You remember Sidney, Emma's elder brother, who was responsible for all the Fitzwilliam estates, because there was the irresponsible elder brother living the life. In Paris, Sidney was administering all the estates. Sidney got the same Thomas Wyatt to build St Bartholomew's Church in Ballsbridge, which is another extraordinary church. And, of course, later on, the church here, that the Church of Ireland Church, St Michael and All Angels in Abbeyleix. So it's interesting that there's Wyatt, and there's quite a few connections you'll find of Irish artists, architects, sculptors. There's quite a lot of Irish plug-in, not only from Emma, but also from her mother and the Herbert family in general. St Nicholas cost £20,000, and as I said, that was a colossal amount of money then. It was very lavish inside. It managed to have marble columns from Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which somehow Sir William Hamilton had got his hands on. William Hamilton is most famous for being the husband of Emma, who was Admiral Nelson's big squeeze in life. I don't know how he got his hands on the columns. I suppose he couldn't get his hands on Emma, so he got his hands on the columns of St Maria Maggiore. Anyway, they ended up in, having been bought by Sidney, they ended up in this church. And it clearly meant a huge amount to Catherine, Countess of Pembroke, and they had a medal made of the building of the church. Here we are, and it's very hard to read. It says Wilton Church. There was a little medal in a little case that I've been lucky enough I've been lucky enough that it came down to me. And one of the things I've really found so rewarding as I grew up after I lost my parents was making all these little discoveries and putting all the jigsaw pieces together. Emma was very close to her brother Sidney, and there he is as he gets older. Sidney entered Parliament aged 22, very capable guy, and by the time he was 35 he was in the cabinet, and by 1845 he was Secretary for War, which was a very important position in those days when wars were more frequent, and interestingly enough put him in quite interesting positions vis-à-vis his Russian relatives. He was part of the coalition government, and there's a picture of him here in the cabinet, and he's that one there. He was young. Funny enough, that was his brother-in-law. He had married, that's Lord Lansdowne. He'd married one of Sidney's sisters. And in 1846, Sidney married another rather beautiful lady who was called Elizabeth, who, interestingly enough, was a very devout Catholic, a great friend of Cardinal Manning's, a great friend of Cardinal Vaughan's, and a great philanthropist. And they had 7 children, all of whom, you can have a whole talk on their children. One of their children, Elizabeth, married Sir Hubert Parry, the composer. But the most interesting association with Sidney is probably this lady here, Florence Nightingale. Sidney met Florence Nightingale and was tremendously impressed by her. She came from a pretty grand family, and nursing was not a profession that people from grand families went into. Elizabeth had a really strong vocation in life. She really was utterly focused on nursing, and that's what she wanted to do. She went off and studied abroad. She came back, and she very much impressed Sidney. He was the minister in charge of the War Department, and he asked Florence Nightingale, would she send a team, or go out with a team, to the Crimean War? Because by this time, Britain was actually at war with Russia, which was kind of awkward, since it was his uncle. So you had all these interesting different. They weren't really tensions, but they did make for interesting relationships. So Florence Nightingale went out with a team of, I think it was 38 nurses to the battlefields of Crimea, where she was horrified by the conditions, because if you were wounded then the conditions were so bad that you were really unlikely to survive even a relatively mild wound. You were dragged really to a sort of hut where there were rats running around, and such was the level of infection that you were pretty much doomed. She really revolutionized this and understood that the importance of hygiene, of having space between beds, of having ventilation, and she utterly transformed the whole concept of nursing. And Sidney Herbert understood how many lives were being saved, not purely on a humanitarian point of view, because he was very much humanitarian minded, as was his wife Elizabeth, but he also realized just purely militarily, I mean, they were losing far more men from mild wounds than they would lose them from being killed outright. There is the sort of iconic picture of Florence Nightingale, the Lady of the Lamp, as she was known, as we all know, going round the wards at night. This was entirely due to Sidney backing her. And if it hadn't been for Sidney Herbert, Lady De Vesci's brother, Florence Nightingale, we'd never have heard of Florence Nightingale. Nursing would not have changed. There wouldn't be the Nightingale wards that still exist in hospitals. So one cannot overestimate the impact that she made, and she wouldn't have made that without Lady De Vesci's brother, Sidney. And there she is. There's a photograph of her later. From a magazine, contemporary magazine, here's a picture of Sidney, living celebrities, and a description of his accomplishments politically. But he worked incredibly hard and sort of burnt himself out, really. He really compromised his health by working so hard. Around this time, 1855, John, the 2nd Viscount de Vesci, died. He was 84 when he died, which was a tremendous age to live at that time. And as he got older, of course, his son, Thomas, the 3rd Viscount, who was to be the 3rd Viscount, became more and more influential as John declined in years. I mean, John was still active, but obviously when you're 84, you don't have quite the vigour you had as a young man. So during John's latter years, Thomas, the 3rd Viscount, and Emma were very influential. During the famine years, Thomas got famine fever, and she was very influential in the soup kitchens and various other things which we'll come to later on. In 1856, Emma, who was by then 37, her mother Catherine, Countess of Pembroke, died. And there's this fabulous tomb in the church that she built, St. Nicholas's in Wilton. And it must have left an enormous hole in Emma de Vesci's life. I'm not sure who the sculptor is of this tomb. It's very beautiful. I have seen it. Interesting enough, I'm not sure what the significance is, but her feet are crossed in the tomb. Maybe it's not significant. I suspect it's something one should know. Very beautiful. You can see the angels propping up her pillow. And there's a wall tablet also in memory of her, which is very beautiful, with an inscription underneath. Emma, throughout her mother's latter years and later, was constantly sending her mother pictures of designs. She became increasingly interested in schools, in buildings, in shaping some of the buildings in Abbeyleix. Schools were particularly of interest to her, and there are lots of designs that she did in her folio of designs of schools. Am I talking for way too long? I have no idea what the time is. Am I okay? You can go home if you're bored. there are these drawings of schools. There's Emma, middle-aged by this stage. That's what she looked like in a bust, and that's a bust that I'm lucky enough to have. I've lost the run of myself here, have I? Have I skipped? Yeah. Emma too wanted to make her mark in Abbeyleix, and she too was interested in building a church, and also she was always interested in the landscape. It's quite interesting. That tree is quite redolent of the cedars at Wilton, and Emma's attention was fastened on St. Michael's Church here. I mean, Emma would have been very influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church. Her grandfather, the ambassador, was buried in the Greek Orthodox Church in Marylebone. Catherine, her mother, would have been brought up Russian Orthodox. There would have been an aspect of that in Emma's life very much. She was very conscious of landscape, and that's, as you all know, our church here, St. Michael's in Abbeyleix. Very beautiful landscape. It was already there, but she hugely enlarged it. She built the chancel, which is the far end of it, and the apse, which is the curvy bit at the altar, and the two side altars. So she really enormously enlarged it in size. And it is spectacular. As I know, as children, we never went in there because of this sort of silly idea that you stuck to your own tradition, which I'm glad is no longer the case. But you know, I was in my late teens before I really became familiar with it and realized how wonderful this building is. And those who are not familiar with it should really go and have a look around, because it is spectacular. And Emma built this, as I said, or greatly extended it and beautified it after her mother died. And there is the plaque in memory of her mother. It says, to the honour and glory of God, with the aid of a grant by the Ecclesiastical Commission, Emma, wife of Thomas, 3rd Viscount de Vesci, rebuilt the nave of this church, added the chancel and aisles, in grateful and pious memory of her mother, Catherine, Countess of Pembroke and Montgomery. And I particularly like the border, which really speaks of Abbeyleix in that it is a mixture of shamrocks and acorns, both of which I think characterise the shamrocks being our island and the acorns being very much speaking of Abbeyleix and our ancient oaks here. I did gallop ahead of myself by turning over 2 pages at once and mention schools, and Emma was very interested in schools and school design, and I'm sure it's no coincidence that in her sketchbooks we have Hythe schools. Hythe is in Kent in England. I don't know why she was in Kent, but she was clearly interested in schools, in school design. And here's another one in nearby Folkestone, another school, very interested in the design of it. And she was not only interested in the exterior design and how picturesque it would look, but actually how it worked in terms of the layout of the rooms and so forth, and cottages. It was really the practicality as well of, you know, bathrooms, where the fireplaces were to be. So it was not just purely a superficial interest. And interestingly enough, she was quite keen on putting her initials on things, and particularly her monogram. And when she became Lady De Vesci, she did like putting E de V with a coronet showing that she was a Viscountess on it. And you'll see that appears more and more of her drawings. She did various different experiments with different designs of her initials. And you can see this one she obviously rather liked, and then other ones later on as she perfected it. Here are more designs, and you can see she's written E de V's ideas. And again, this is quite interesting in relation to the South School. I see Arthur in amongst us. There's an oriel window. I don't know if you're familiar. They're the windows that stick out a bit, but don't go down to the ground. And these are oriel windows here. And you see one of those appearing in the South School, which are not very common in Ireland. And although this is clearly not a design for the South School does have a lot of the characteristics of this drawing. And by this time, Emma had sort of hit on the design for her monogram that she liked best. It had a double E in it, and that really confused us all for a while, because if you look carefully around the town, you will see this monogram on some of the buildings with a double E. And I was particularly puzzled because I thought, well, who's the other E? And the next Viscountess de Vesci's name also began with E. She was Evelyn, and I thought it must be the two E's, but I think it's pretty clear that it wasn't two people, it was just the same E for Emma appearing twice, because it was rather a good design. So that is the design that appears on the South School, because South School was built in two different periods, and it has really puzzled us all. But I think that it's just Emma. The double E is just Emma appearing twice, because it was a design she liked. She had her own seal for stamping sealing wax on, and you can see the bottom of the seal here. Also, it's funny, it looks like 96 or something, but if you stamp it, it's the D of De Vesci. Again, it's a double E and a V, and again, she's quite proud of her Viscountess's coronet. And this is the South School, where I hope Arthur doesn't mind me talking endlessly about his house. But this is the South School as it started, a much smaller affair, and we're probably familiar with South School on the Balacolla Road. When it started, it was a much smaller affair, and it faced in the direction of Balacolla. And that was the entrance, which is not the entrance you see from the road. And it's a side. This is a view that probably many people are not familiar with. So forgive me, Arthur. I hope you don't mind me rattling on about it. And that's the South School as it started, and it was enlarged significantly and pivoted on its axis, because one of the things that happened soon after it was built was the railway came along right in front of the front door, which probably wasn't great if you were a school child going into school and the train was coming. So they pivoted it 90 degrees, and you now see this symmetrical, much wider facade with two doors. One was the teacher's residence, and the other led to schoolrooms. You can see the original date stone, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture. That's the date stone 1843. And on those two doors that we're familiar with now, above one of them has E de V with a double E, and 1843, that same date that the school was started in. The left-hand, that's the bit we were looking at from that side. And then over this door is another date stone, again the same E de V with the double E's, but exactly 50 years later. And I'm not quite sure what happened. It's difficult to tell, because the Ordnance Survey maps don't tell us exactly what happened then, or the significance of why it's exactly 50 years later. But they are, those who can figure out the Roman numerals above each of these doors can discern that one is 1843 and the other one is exactly 50 years later, 1893. And here's the same monogram in the North School above Heritage House. Again, the double E and the Viscountess's coronet. And there is Emma, a very early photograph of her, obviously posed, and as Sinead was explaining how these photographs were done, she probably had to stand in that position for some time. I'm not sure what the date of this is, but it is really interesting to see her as she would have looked to the eye, as opposed to a painting or a print or a sculpture. And another picture of her. She seems to have been called Laois, and I have no idea why. It's just written in this photograph book. She's knitting. She was clearly keen on embroidery, on knitting, on design, all these things. But constantly with the influence of her childhood home of Wilton, which she was so keen on, and she had this folio of drawings of Wilton, which she brought to Abbeyleix with her, and which she referred to, and this spectacular room, which I showed you at the beginning, the double cube room of Wilton, obviously was something she was hugely fond of, and as I said, so worth a visit if you're there. Also, during her mother's lifetime, Wilton was changed quite a bit. T.H. Wyatt from Roscommon had quite a hand in some of the alterations to Wilton at that time, and also in the terraces at Wilton. And I think it was these terraces at Wilton that had quite an influence on the terraces of Abbeyleix House. Some of the sort of guidebooks and things got, I think, a little carried away. It said it was the palace in Russia, Lucca, that influenced them. I think it was much more Wilton, and it was the fashion of the time. Wilton wasn't the only place to have this sort of symmetrical garden, formal beds, armies of gardeners, statues, urns. Abbeyleix was landscaped much in the same way at more or less the same time. And it was during this time that constantly designs were going backwards and forwards with pictures of urns, pictures of fountains, pictures of statues, designs for symmetrical flower beds between Lady Pembroke and Lady De Vesci. And there's all these letters with the suppliers of urns and statues and things saying, at the request of Lady Pembroke, I'm sending on to your ladyship this design. And another one saying, at the request of Lady De Vesci, I'm sending on to you this design. And so they went backwards and forwards. But aside from all that somewhat superficial stuff, she was very hands-on in Abbeyleix, Emma de Vesci. During the famine, she would be very instrumental in the soup kitchens, which, whilst they weren't brilliant, they did save an awful lot of lives. I think she would have had a huge influence with her husband Thomas and her father-in-law in the decision of no, there was not going to be a big estate wall built around Abbeyleix, that the famine works, of which were very extensive, would not be an estate wall to keep people out of the estate. It's almost unique in Ireland in being a big estate without an estate wall. But there was tremendous amount of drainage works, all the bog drainage works, all these and more worthwhile works were undertaken, but not the estate wall. She also started the Baby Linen Society, which many of you will be familiar with. There's a little bit in the Heritage House about it, I think. This was a scheme where people who didn't have much money, who were girls who were expecting a baby, had to make a deposit. It wasn't that small. It was 1 6, quite a bit. And you paid that money before your baby was due, and when you went into confinement, you got that money back, double your money back. And in addition to that, oatmeal, sugar, all the necessities you'd really need with a baby, and 2 pairs of sheets, night dresses, bed gowns, nightcaps, and so forth. And at the end, when your baby was being weaned, and later on, you'd give back the nightcaps, the bed gowns, and so forth. Obviously, the perishables you'd eaten, and you had that cash boost from having doubled your money. So that I think was hugely. I think it was unique. I don't think anyone else had ever done that in Ireland, and I think it was hugely influential. They also had a laundry school, the old laundries on the way into Abbeyleix in the back way by Millbrook, where they were teaching girls the basics about laundry and how to work in laundries, and that was quite important if you were actually looking for employment in a country house in a domestic capacity. And in the old church, the last matron, I think, of the laundry school, her tombstone is there. Jane McCook, I think she was. The last matron, she died in 1891, age 62. And I think it says for 24 years she was a matron of the Abbeyleix Laundry Training School. But perhaps Emma might be best known in Abbeyleix for this building, Pembroke Terrace, with immense publicity for the O'Briens that seem to be here. I'm still waiting my fiver, please. Thank you. This was Emma was very influential in building this. Now, whether she bankrolled the whole thing, she would have inherited the 20 grand from her father, must have trickled through by now, and I'm sure her mother, who not only had the Russian inheritance, but also that huge money from Lord Pembroke. Emma would have had a good few bob in her savings account, so I don't know whether Emma paid for this or whether her husband Thomas paid for it. It was certainly named Pembroke Terrace in honour of Emma's mother. The initial houses were the bank, the constabulary, the post office, and the inspector of the constabulary. That was the initial purposes of that. But she was very hands-on in the neighbourhood, not only in building various obvious things like that, but also in the layout of the town as it developed. And I came across this drawing in her hand, and I hope it's legible. It's actually Pallins's Cross, Old Town Cross on the Balacolla Road. And interesting enough, the names haven't changed that much. You can see Pallins here. This is the road that takes you up to Black Hill. That's Tully Road, that's going into Abbeyleix, as you can see, to Rathdowney, and this is the back way into the estate. And this oak tree, I'm pretty sure, is the one that's there to this day. It's on the, if you look at it now, that grass triangle, the corner nearest Abbeyleix has an old oak tree on it, and it's probably that. It looks as though they were considering putting maybe a cottage there. Lister's, the old mill further in, was Lister's Mill. So she was really interested in just the layout of the roads and so on at that time, and not just in building big monuments. And it is in her hand. You can see E de V. It wasn't anybody else doing this. It was her. In 1861, very young, aged just 51, her brother Sidney, the great man behind Florence Nightingale, died. He had just kind of worked himself to death. He did actually die of Bright's disease, but brought on, I think, through exhaustion. He was a tremendously philanthropic person, and his monument is there. That's his mother on the other side of that's her tomb we looked at earlier, and this amazing tomb that is in keeping, almost matching his mother's tomb. Very beautiful, again, angels on his cushion. And he's almost saint-like in the way he's depicted. And the side of the tomb there, and interesting enough, if you zoom in on this panel here, you can see there he is depicted talking to Florence Nightingale, and I hope you can see there the nurses in the background nursing the wounded soldiers. Yeah, he was an extraordinary man, and recognised as such. Anybody knows London really well might recognise this. It's the bottom end of Lower Regent Street. It's called Waterloo Place, and there's the monument for the guards regiments of the Crimean War, which is this here. That is Florence Nightingale, and that is Sidney Herbert. So that's Emma de Vesci's brother there. The statue is by John Henry Foley, another Irish artist, sculptor. He also is famous for the Albert Memorial, Prince Albert in gold there, if anyone has been in Hyde Park lately. Also, Daniel O'Connell in O'Connell Street. That's also by John Henry Foley. And Father Matthew in Patrick Street in Cork. In 1875, Thomas died. He was aged 72. And 1884, Emma herself died. She was just 64 when she died. She died on the 10th of October. And that's her tomb there in the old church. I'm not sure the date of this photograph. Doesn't look as though the old church was in great shape then. It's very interesting for us as we're trying to restore the old church with tremendous help from Catherine Casey, our heritage officer, and various grants. Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage Historic Structures Fund has given a lot of money to restoring the old church, which is administered by the County Council. And the tower and roof were repaired by the Structures at Risk scheme. And we've availed of generous grants from the Built Heritage Investment Scheme, also administered by Laois County Council and the Heritage Council. So all these grants are so important in hanging on to our old buildings. And as we do that, it's interesting to us to see, we can see the panelling and this curious stove here. It looks as though the monument is quite recently placed. It doesn't look as though they put the floor in. I can't be sure of what date it is. But all this panelling has gone and was replaced by different things. So it's an interesting photograph for us. And this is a more recent picture of Emma. I don't know if you can read it clearly. Emma, Viscountess de Vesci, widow of Thomas, 3rd Viscount de Vesci, daughter of George Augustus, 11th Earl of Pembroke, and Catherine, Countess Vorontsov, his wife, died on the 10th of October 1844 in the 64th year of her age. And I only last year came across a letter from Queen Victoria, written 3 days after Emma had died. And she wrote a letter to Emma's sister. And she wrote, "I cannot remain silent at this moment of deep distress when you have lost your dear sister, my dear old playfellow whom I see before me, now as the beautiful Emma Herbert, when we were children together." She added that she received the news only yesterday, without knowing of her being ill, even shocked me inexpressibly, and having so lately seen you and heard from you that your dear sister was well, I can scarcely believe it possible that she should have been taken after so short an illness. I feel terribly sad for her children. So that's from Queen Victoria. I had no idea that Emma as a child had played with Queen Victoria. But I hope that I haven't bored you to tears, and that I think it is interesting, particularly with what's happening in Crimea now and in Russia and all the different connections. And I don't think Emma was kind of appreciated enough. And I think the Russian aspect of life is really interesting. And I think Sidney Herbert and Florence Nightingale, Sidney Herbert, might have come to Abbeyleix. I don't know that he didn't. It's quite likely that he did. But a pretty close tie with Emma de Vesci's brother. And of course the fever hospital and so forth would have been at that time. It's difficult to imagine there wouldn't have been strong back and forth influences, and that Florence Nightingale wouldn't have had a fairly direct influence on the fever hospital and so forth, and the goings on in Abbeyleix. So thank you for not throwing anything at me.